Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Iron Africa. My name is Awasar, and I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs here at the African Studies Center, Michigan State University. And Eye on Africa is our bi-weekly seminary series. We're very delighted, and happy to have Dr. Jennifer Lee Johnson today as our speaker. And before I pass it over to her, brief introduction. So Dr. Jennifer Lee Johnson is an associate professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University. Her scholarship is situated at the intersection of environmental anthropology, history, and sustainability science, with a long-term research program focused on the historical and contemporary politics of ecological knowledge in the African Great Lakes region. Her forthcoming book, Sustainability or Otherwise, Ontological Justice Along an Inland African Sea, Duke University Press 2027, examines how singular Euro-American versions of sustainability do actual violence to residents of African fishing communities and the broader world they inhabit. Dr. Johnson's research in Africa has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Werner Grant Foundation for Anthropological Research, the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, the University of Michigan, and Purdue and Yale universities. Beyond the inland seas of East Africa, Dr. Johnson's second book project pivots to the US, Midwest, and an investigation of ontological justice within mixed industrial residential landscapes in small and mid-sized cities. This community-engaged research moves beyond narratives of ruin to document how residents reclaim health and agency, transforming sites of contamination into spaces of radical care, enduring grief, and remarkable persistence. Thank you so very much, Dr. Johnson, for being here and for sharing.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And yes, I'm going to share a chapter with you from that forthcoming book, Sustainability Otherwise. And it's such a treat to be here because it's the first time I've ever presented this material, even though I've been exploring this parts of this work with audiences for a long time. So I really appreciate this opportunity to challenge myself to share this work with you today, too. So before I get a little into the book and the chapter, I want to just share a bit about how I came to write it. So the man you see in the left, in the teal top, his name is Bakachi Robert. And he is right here standing at a place called Chigungu, which is a fish landing site on Uganda's southern shores. He's giving a tour to secondary school students here. And behind him are statues I'm going to tell you about in a few minutes when I get into our topic at hand today. But I first met Bakachi in 2008, and I'd come to Uganda to study fisheries management on Lake Victoria. And it's one of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world and the site of one of the most intensively managed fisheries on the African continent. So I was interested myself in the so-called illegal fish trade and in the donor-driven experiments in fisheries co-management there. I was also interested in what happened when globally circulating norms about sustainability meet or collide with the realities of people who actually lived and worked and ate along these shores. So when I first met Bakachi, he was the vice chairman of his local beach management unit, which is one of these co-management institutions. And we met and we had a lot to talk about around fisheries, and our relationship deepened over many years. And he is still a really interesting and inquisitive man. His friends also called him the American for his genuine love of the image of democracy and economic opportunity that, at least when we first met in 2008, the United States appeared to project from places like Uganda. He's a self-proclaimed fisherman by birth, and one himself who was doing his best to save Lake Victoria. So, because he himself was an intellectual, we started interviewing ladies and men who worked with fish, as well as elders, to explore what became a shared set of questions around this body of water. I also met Akello, who's a young woman, younger at the time, who taught me how to clean and hot smoke and sell fish in local and regional markets. And that was a really big part of the methodology of my work itself, living and working in fishing sites, processing fish, selling them with women, and getting to know what that work was like, and what life was like there. So together, Akello and I also made many friends and forged kin-like relations with an extended family that both taught us both how to work with new kinds of fish and also how to properly honor the ancestors of the sea. And so that's when things really got interesting for me. Because the more time I spent along these shores with Bakachi, with Akello, with fish, with others, with ancestors, the more I understood that there were actually multiple bodies of water here. One was Lake Victoria, this colonial version of a body of water, one that is a management object, one that can be contained, one that is now seen as a resource that can be saved by the right combination of net sizes and catch limits and international donor funds. Another body of water is Nyanja, which simply translates as sea. It's a vernacular word used not just along the southern shores of Uganda, but much further into southern Africa as well. And this is the body of water that residents still live and work with most closely. This is a sea with its own histories, its own ancestors, and as we'll hear, its own kings. Nyanja is a sea that fisheries managers cannot see and therefore cannot save. And so that tension is a core piece in the book itself. And also why history, looking back into the past, became really interesting and important for me to understand what sustainability is, how a dominant version of it became framed, and also how it could be otherwise. So again, this work started about being about Lake Victoria, and so it's still about that, but it's also about Nyanja and other even more ancient bodies of water here, and how Nyanja's histories in particular have been submerged and yet continue to persist. And so sustainability is not a singular trajectory here, not the management of singular resources towards a predetermined future, but something multiple, contested, alive, and still living in the worlds that official stories and dominant versions about what reality even is worked really hard to submerge. So here's a map from a German publication in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And you can see the body of water is marked as Victoria Nyanza and then translated as sea. So Lake Victoria is something that comes in and is made possible through a series of transformations in the late 1800s and early 1900s in this area that gives the impression, or at least creates a version of this body of water that is contained, it is controllable. And there was a heck of a lot of violence and suffering and death that went alongside framing that version. And still, there's this persistence. So this chapter, the Kabaka Multiple, also asks who these historical worlds, who these bodies of water belong to and how they worked in some ways. As the title of my talk suggests, women were a seriously large part of that work. So I want to begin here with two versions of the same story. Both of them happened at Chigungu, where we saw Bakachi Robert and the students in that first photograph. So every February 17th, hundreds of people travel to Chigungu, which is a fish landing site on Uganda's southern shores. And they're there to commemorate the arrival of the first white fathers, the French Catholic missionaries who came to save the souls of the Buganda people by spreading Christianity to residents there. As fishermen bring their boats to land after a long night at sea, congregants set up large tents and white plastic chairs, and the festivities begin. All Ugandans who attend primary school are taught a similar version of what happened next. So on February 17th, 1879, two men called Pères Blancs, or White Fathers in English, landed on the shores of Chigungu. They spoke French, and they'd come from Belgium. Their names were Friar Lordel and Brother Amans, And they were also known to residents as Mapera, or at least one of them was, which is a vernacular version of mon père, or French for my father. As soon as they landed and rested a bit, so the story goes, they asked to be taken to see the Kabaka, the king. Although missionaries worked alongside colonial administrators to fundamentally transform the so-called traditional institutions through wars of conquest and colonial domination, overall, as the official story goes, and the one that's taught to every Ugandan who takes primary school, which is compulsory, the arrival of the White Fathers was a good thing because they also brought reading, writing, and their Christian God. There still are life-size statues of these White Fathers in Chigungu. Both are set in white stone, kneeling on a large concrete plinth, surrounded by a wrought iron fence. One holds his hand in prayer, and the other extends his arms towards heaven. Between them, a plaque reads, "On this spot landed the first Catholic missionaries of Uganda on the 17th day of February, 1879. Sometimes, as you have seen, during fierce storms and when water levels are particularly high, these two men also become submerged by the sea." So here's a photo of these White Fathers, and here's another version of this history. So residents of Chigungu still tell their own story of the arrival of the first European missionaries. They too recognize them as Mapera, but according to residents who still remember the histories their ancestors once told, the conditions of their actual arrival went a lot less smoothly than that standard taught history would suggest. Just as these White Fathers were approaching Chigungu for the very first time, their boat hit a sharp rock just beneath the surface of the sea, not far from shore, and they started sinking. Our ancestors, some residents of Chigungu still remember, knew the rock was there. As they stood on shore and saw these strange men starting to drown, they rushed to their boats and into the water. People say these White Fathers had come to save us, some residents of Chigungu say. But in actuality, we saved them. Like this rock under the sea that littoral residents, but not White Fathers, were trained to see, it's still possible to access these worlds, these historical worlds, once we stop drowning in commitments to singularity. And in this case, commitments to a singular body of water called Lake Victoria. And so that is what this chapter is about, and what sustainability otherwise is about too. So the boats of Chigungu's fishermen, the same people who knew the rock was there, the same people who launched their boats and pulled the White Fathers from water, the same people whose knowledge, relationships, and ancestors have been organizing life along these shores for centuries, and whose worlds Lake Victoria managers and official history cannot quite see, are absolutely vital. So when the White Fathers first arrived in Chigungu in 1879, soaking wet from their near-death experience with the sea, and they asked to be taken to see the Kabaka, they would have had to specify which king they wanted to see, because at the time, there were at least 3 Kabaka of Buganda, and at least 2 of them were women. Kabaka is a royal title translated into English as king. This translation adequately reflects the contemporary infrastructure of the Buganda Kingdom, but it does not accurately represent the nature of historical forms of kingship there. So this contemporary association between the vernacular word Kabaka equals king equals singular male figure is reflected of the world-making practices that accompanied the imposition and adoption of Christianity and colonial rule in this area. Also, the time that a sea becomes a lake. So kingship along the shores of the Nyanja, what is now called Lake Victoria by some, was multiple and multiply gendered. It was not something held by a singular person, let alone a singular man. No single Kabaka had ever served on their throne prior to 1897, when the British colonial administration crowned a 1-year-old boy as the singular symbolic king of the colonial reordered Buganda Kingdom. And here he is a bit older. The contemporary association between Kabaka equals king equals singular male figure is, again, reflective of those world-making practices. So the existence of multiple female kings itself was not something concealed from Europeans. It was not something they could claim ignorance about. The missionary Reverend Ash wrote home to the Christian Missionary Society in 1885 that there are, quote, as you know, three persons in Buganda with the style and title of king or Kabaka. Each holds a separate court and has his or her own chiefs, for two of the kings, or Baka Baka, are ladies. The king's mother one, the king's sister two, and the king himself. Foundational vernacular language dictionaries like Pilkington's 1892 Luganda English and English Luganda vocabulary, these were consulted by most, probably many European visitors to Uganda, or many or most, we'll see, defined Kabaka in the dictionary as king or queen. Three persons in Uganda bear this title: the king, the queen mother, and the queen sister. Pilkington's entry for the English word king, however, consolidates all of this multiplicity and is simply defined as Kabaka. So that single line then in that dictionary does a lot of work. And at the same time, in 1885 and 1892, it was well known amongst those who knew about this area, those Euro-Americans who knew about this area, that there were multiple kings in Buganda. So to simplify this elaboration of multiplicity here and in the work, I retain the English translation of Kabaka as king, but I specify which king I'm referring to. So we have a king mother, a king daughter, a king son, a king of the sea. That term queen doesn't really exist, or at least didn't in this historical period in Luganda. So it's not a term that I think is worth using here. The figure of a queen later was invented in later periods of time. So we had the singular male Kabaka, the king's son, but we also had a king mother, a king daughter, and a fourth Kabaka recognized by literal residents and many Buganda too, called Kabaka Mukasa, or the king of the sea. This was an especially powerful figure that Europeans first encountered as an elder woman. But all four of these were Kabaka. All four were simultaneously king, and at least in the late 1800s, all but one of them were women. The king mother, according to Frederick Lugard, an emissary of the British East Africa Company and the Maxim gun, was a person of great importance and power. Her authoritative infrastructure was one in which, quote, women predominated. She held the power to compel the most important men of the kingdom to labor in her gardens, an activity that was otherwise beneath them. She was known for keeping the best maintained banana plantations in all of Uganda, and when powerful men visited, she reportedly required them to plant a banana tree in her garden, partly to show off her plantations and partly, as the source knows, to, quote, humble him. The king daughter was installed with great ceremony alongside her brother, the king's son, and exercised considerable power, advising the hereditary chiefs of her and his cabinet. The extent of the instrumental power that these women held, let alone their existence as kings, now seems impossible for most scholars and lay people to appreciate. The reality of their formal presence has been submerged in over a century of patriarchal refusal and historical fiction. Bit more on that shortly, but first we'll turn to the king of the sea, Kabaka Mukasa. In late 1879, less than 1 year after the arrival of the White Fathers at Chigungu, Kabaka Mukasa, the king of the sea, in all their multiplicity, represented the single biggest threat to the spread of Christianity and colonial governance throughout the Buganda Kingdom, and perhaps across East and Central Africa as a whole. Residents from diverse food provisioning traditions and artisanal specializations converged within Kabaka Mukasa's amphibious estates. The sort of central estate of Kabaka was located in the Sese Islands, an archipelago of literally hundreds of gorgeous islands that are associated with other ancestral figures. But properties of Mukasa were also extending along the shores, along southern Uganda, and indeed along the entire body of water that English speakers now call Lake Victoria. So Kabaka Mukasa simultaneously offered protection from and justification for the largely unpredictable harms that were still possible at the littoral. These included waterspouts and lightning and the dangers of childbirth and infertility. Mukasa, if properly placated, was known to offer abundant catches of fish, safe sea transport, rain for growing agricultural crops, and healthy children in general and healthy twins in particular. Boats traveling on the sea were adorned with decor that clearly marked them as moving with the blessing and under the protection of the king of the sea. And here what we're seeing is an adaptation to those, quote, traditional canoes here. You see on the left a sunscreen that this European man was very proud to have built on these vessels. But you see the prow of the horns and other materials that mark these vessels as blessed by and belonging to Mukasa and the radical peace, as we'll hear more about, that Mukasa represented. So before traveling on the sea, fishermen, boat captains, and other travelers gave offerings to Kabaka Mukasa and asked for their blessing, hoping to travel safely and return with an abundance of fish or other goods. Missionaries, of course, found this practice, in their words, backwards. And yet these same missionaries frequently wrote letters home requesting that their readers pray for their safe passage on the very same sea. In 1884, Alexander Mackay wrote to the Church Missionary Society after relaunching a damaged vessel. And he asked everyone, "May we have your prayers that this little vessel may prove of much service in furthering the gospel of Christ on the shores of the Nyanza." Apparently, it was not the act of requesting prayers for safety on the sea that missionaries found problematic. It was to whom one was doing that asking. To complicate things even further, at the time of colonial contact, Kabaka Mukasa, the king of the sea, was a position shared by at least two people: a female medium who issued sacred guidance on behalf of the ancestors, and a male priest responsible for ensuring that the ancestors could continue to speak through her. So Mukasa's estates, as I mentioned, were not just multiple, they were many. And the places and people dedicated to Mukasa once encircled the entire sea and many of its islands, far exceeding the geographic territory of the Buganda Kingdom itself. According to Apollo Kagwa, the first auto-ethnographer of Buganda that we'll hear about later, Kabaka Mukasa was famous for radical peace. In Kagwa's words, or at least an English translation of Kagwa's words, quote, "Mukasa was supposed to be very good and kind and considered everybody their child, never killing anyone. When Mukasa came all around, all the prisoners on her estates were set free." The Church Missionary Society missionaries and the White Fathers had been working since their arrival in 1878 and 79 to gain influence with the king's son, the legitimate king, Kabaka, in their eyes. Their goal was to convince him of the superiority of Christianity and to the still durable religion that centered around Kabaka Mukasa and a constellation of mediums, priests, and supplicants. So there was this tension. Missionaries were really trying to push belief in their God over figures like Kabaka Mukasa, as well as Islam, that is also another part of the story and is not one that is presented here. But these missionaries were committed to making it clear to the king's son that as far as these white men were concerned, they knew no other court in Uganda than this one, meaning the singular male king. That was their court. For these men, the king mother and the king's sister existed as relatives of the king, but not as actual kings themselves. So here is a photo that appeared in Colonial Administrator Cunningham's 1905 book, Uganda and its Peoples. And this photo was titled Mukasa and Her Court. This is ostensibly the female medium who was representing Mukasa in that early colonial period. So in late 1879, Kabaka Mukasa and their people were fed up. The king of the sea decided to close the sea. So at this time, there was a lot of conflict. There were new people coming in. There were a lot of expeditions that caused a lot of depredations to people who lived along the shoreline. Things were heating up, and Kabaka Mukasa said, hey, we actually need to shut this down. So no one, except those explicitly authorized by Kabaka Mukasa, was allowed to travel on this, the largest body of fresh water in Africa at the time. So this also speaks to the sophisticated and widespread networks of King Mukasa that this message was able to travel far and actually be enforced to the detriment of Euro-American traders, missionaries, as well as others from the Swahili coast. So Cunningham described this particular moment when Mukasa shut down the sea. Quote, Mukasa's priest had numerous fanatics in her service, and they would sweep the lake in small rafts and canoes with lighted brands and hideous howling. And the sailors in service of the mocker there were soon put to flight. So the king mother urged the king's son at this time, this moment of crisis, to travel to the islands to meet with the king of the sea and resolve the crisis, because that was the normative order. The king's son traveled to Mukasa, but he refused. So some of those missionaries' protestations were working. Soon after, because things were so serious, the female medium of Kabaka Mukasa, who is probably pictured here, traveled across the sea from her island to the mainland, and she also came with two powerful female mediums of the Lubale, Nyende and Chibuka. But together they spent considerable time consulting with their contemporaries about the changes unfurling around their sea. So spent time meeting with their own counselors along the shores to really see what should be done and really think about what was happening at the time. So meanwhile, Protestant missionary Alexander Mackay, who was a self-proclaimed missionary of engineering, but a man that his biographers, including his own sister, called Uganda's white man of work. He arrived in Buganda and met with the king's son. He is especially himself known for being frustrated that the king's son at the time spent more time asking Mackay to repair his guns than he did requesting spiritual guidance. But Alexander Mackay rebranded himself. He called himself the anti-Mukasa. That is how serious it was that Mukasa had been forming this force that was at that time outpowering the existing configurations of power that missionaries and colonial folks tried to establish. So Mackay lectured the king's son repeatedly against witchcraft in every form. This is a quote, above all as manifested in such a being as Mukasa, the god of the Nyanza. He argued that it was Mukasa who was causing rebellion and destabilizing the country. Mukasa, perhaps obviously, had the opposite opinion. When King Mutesa, the king's son at the time, confessed to Mackay that it was his mother, the king mother, and her friends who were the main supporters of figures like Kabaka Mukasa, Mackay challenged the king's son's masculinity directly. He said, "It appears there are now two kings in Uganda, and one of them is a woman." And he meant that as an insult. After several months of consultations, Kabaka Mukasa issued the prophecy that she had come to the mainland to issue. She said war was imminent. Perhaps not now, but maybe in a few years, because the king's son had received the white men. And we know that this was her prophecy because it was what guys like Mackay and Wilson and other missionaries at the time were writing back home in their letters, letters that were published and republished and widely read by a largely British public, but also others who were interested. These became like serial kinds of publications, and they're available widely and freely online now. So Mukasa issued a prophecy. War was imminent, maybe not now, but in the future for sure, because the king's son had received the white men. More specifically, she said, white-skinned strangers with the intention of taking over Buganda would carry a boat overland and enter Buganda through the, quote, back door. So there was a normative order of movement around the sea. If you're familiar with the area, so starting around Kisumu and going south through Tanzania and Mwanza, and really receiving sort of the blessing of people associated with other mainland and island shores there, moving up towards Mukasa's domain. So it made sure that this area was protected. There were also large islands on that eastern portion. I'd be happy to talk about more, but I don't think it's fully necessary for the story. The point is, there was a normative order of movement, and Mukasa said that white men would carry a boat overland, entering Buganda through the back door, through that eastern portion, rather than on the water via the Sese Islands in the west, as was the custom. So Mackay, when he was writing back, telling people about this, dismissed these concerns. In fact, he put exclamation points as he was writing about this, saying, this is absurd. This is ridiculous. Can you believe we're here to take over? It would soon become clear, though, that Mukasa and the elders were absolutely correct. White men did aspire to conquer Buganda, and they did begin entering through the back door. Eventually, they made world-altering transformations to Buganda's national institutions, too. So in 1884, this is not a surprise for anyone here, but Europe's imperial powers began their year-long meeting in Berlin to negotiate the geographical particularities of their scramble for Africa. That same year, a new king's son was placed on the throne alongside a new king mother and a new king daughter. A king daughter who had reportedly been converted to Christianity. So things were continuing to change. An Anglican bishop at the same time subsequently attempted to enter Buganda from the east through that back door. He was murdered, ostensibly with the king's son's blessing, for this extreme violation of the norms of littoral travel, and in fact, as actually fulfilling the prophecy that King Mukasa had issued just 5 years earlier. So one of the missionaries who came after Hannington reportedly said that Hannington had purchased the road to Uganda with this blood, or that he himself even pictured here saying, "Tell the king that I die for Uganda." And Mukasa? Well, when a new colonial chief was appointed to administer the island where Mukasa's estate was located, his first act was to burn Mukasa's house to the ground. There's a lot we don't know about this period of time. A lot of scholarship has focused following the king's son around as he and missionaries moved south and inland and were banished to Seychelles and welcome back again. And a lot of focus on the king's son and the missionaries. We know so much less about the wars of conquest to take over Mukasa's central home. So Martin Hall comes, a Protestant missionary, to preside over these island areas. And when he arrived, he said, and at least wrote, that his heart was full of thankfulness when he saw the house of a Christian teacher that was standing almost on the very spot where Mukasa's house had stood in the old days. Again, we don't know a lot about these wars of administrative conquest, but I do address some of that and the world-making transformations that accompanied them around a pandemic of sleeping sickness that followed. But these wars of conquest would be fought and won at the expense of the female Kabaka and their followers. And yet literal resistance continued. Hall noted that the island of Bukasa, one of Mukasa's major estates, was, quote, the scene of a very bloody battle in one of the civil wars, and the bleached bones and skulls across which one stumbles in the jungle near the lakeside tell a grim story of hard fighting in a hard place. These were places to be fought over. And for extended periods of time, Mukasa and their people were actually victorious in holding back conquest there. And that is a story that I think deserves to be certainly told more often. So, although the authority and the agency that the King of the Sea and her followers exercised would be transformed again through Uganda's colonial encounters, and later by the development efforts of the post-colonial Uganda state, Kabaka Mukasa is still considered by some contemporary residents of these shores to influence the winds, waters, waves, birth of children, and catches of fish. Except now, when literal residents talk about Mukasa, they talk about a man. So despite the visibility of the King of the Sea's female form throughout the entire colonial period, Kabaka Mukasa, the giver of children, fish, peace, and so much more, is now conceived of by scholars, and particularly those scholars studying fisheries, for my interest, as one source calls a, quote, woman-hating god of the lake. So this peaceful figure who gives children, who gives peace, who also Kagwa told us whenever Mukasa comes to estates, anywhere sets all the slaves free, this figure becomes consolidated as a woman-hating god of the lake. This infuriates me, so I'm trying to calm down a little bit. But the submersion, in many ways, was complete, or at least it was almost complete. So I want us to take a second to see how this submersion was accomplished. It wasn't just suddenly the figures went away and we didn't talk about these particular histories, not just politically and materially, but intellectually. So to do that, we need to spend a moment with two figures who did more than almost anyone else to shape how the world came to understand Buganda and its histories. And that is Apollo Kagwa and John Roscoe. And Kagwa is pictured here in the center of this photo. So in 1897, the same year that a one-year-old boy was crowned as the first singular male Kabaka, three regions took over the actual work of governing Buganda. One of them was Apollo Kagwa, who's a Protestant converted Buganda chief who had risen to power through long-held relationships with missionaries and colonial administrators. He was a trusted figure. And he himself would eventually become both the first auto-ethnographer of Buganda and also its de facto prime minister for nearly 2 decades. So beginning in 1889, the Anglican missionary John Roscoe began spending a lot of time with Kagwa. And so he and Kagwa interviewed a lot of landed Buganda chiefs, in some respects in response to a questionnaire that was circulated by Sir James Fraser, the Scottish social anthropologist whose epic work, The Golden Bough, developed a theory of divine kingship that rested in a singular, sacred male king. So we have someone, a Scottish social anthropologist who was looking for evidence in support of his grand theory that would later be published in The Golden Bough. So he sent a number of different missionaries and would-be ethnographers and anthropologists. He sent them something called the, quote, questions on the manners, customs, religion, superstitions, etc., of uncivilized or semi-civilized people. So he sent this with missionaries, travelers, and administrators who were working across the newly or about to be colonized world. So his framework, singular male king, divine authority, hierarchical power, became part of the intellectual universe of European indirect rule itself. It also shaped profoundly how the history of Buganda was documented. And I don't mean to give this particular questionnaire so much power, but rather to situate this within an intellectual universe where multiplicity in Buganda, as elsewhere, gets consolidated through this grand theory of sort of traditional administration through the idea of divine kingship. So Roscoe recognized that he was also writing in a moment of great transformation. He is there trying to figure out what's going on. He's spending a lot of time with Kagwa within the sort of royal enclosures. He's mostly speaking to men, but he is speaking to some ladies as well. Worth noting, not too far later, in 1906, all women in the so-called palace had to be kicked out. The colonial administrators thought they were too rowdy. They said they drank too much alcohol and needed to leave, and that they were putting some unfavorable ideas in the king's son's head. So 1906, all women are removed from this place that was already substantially transformed by the time Roscoe was writing. Okay, so Roscoe's recognizing he's writing in this moment of great transformation. In 1900, he writes to Fraser, the author of that Golden Bough, that divine kingship, that all of what was so very interesting is being swept away at once, at one stroke by the government in the name of civilization. So the things he was interested in studying, he realizes, it appears to be disappearing in the name of setting up a new version and essentially setting up colonial indirect rule. So the laws he was talking about being framed were in relation to the 1900 Buganda Agreement, which simultaneously expanded the territorial boundaries of the Buganda Kingdom. It also formalized colonial land tenure, and importantly for this story of the Nyanja, brought all of the islands of this were around Uganda's southern shores, all of the Sese Islands, all of the Buvuma Islands, literally hundreds of islands, into the kingdom, whether or not islanders saw themselves as subjects of Buganda's king's son. So part of the story of these great transformations is also about taking control of these shorelines as Lake Victoria comes into existence. But in any case, 1900 Buganda Agreement established the sort of formal, at least the enduring version of the agreement that then goes on to more formally set up indirect rule. There were a couple attempts earlier in the 1800s, but those didn't stick because in part of some of the conflicts we described earlier, and especially conflicts around the body of water and islands that we don't actually know much about. So according to Kagwa himself, this is not Kagwa, this is a drawing of the king's son Wanga. Chiefs from the Sese Islands, including Bukasa, Bugala, Kome, and others, did not visit the royal court of the king's son because, quote, history shows that these chiefs were originally as much rulers as the king himself. So Kagwa, in his own text, recognizes this multiplicity of authority. These alternative royals wore brass rings on their legs and multiple hair crests on their heads to distinguish themselves from those who recognized themselves as subjects of the mainland male king's son. Kagwa tells us that a number of these chiefs, particularly those from the Sese Islands, were not satisfied with the administrative changes of early colonial Buganda. And according to Kagwa, they continued wearing those brass rings on their legs well into the 1930s. Some of these figures still do not bow when the singular male king makes a tour around the shore areas. So Kagwa was aware of this multiplicity, aware of this tension, because he himself was trying to legislate it and regulate it. And so he mentions it, and that's wonderful. We can learn something from these sources, even as we actively work to read them differently. So Kagwa and Roscoe, I mentioned, these are two super important men who come to shape really how the tradition and history of this area is understood. It gets picked up by anthropologists, sure, but also historians. And the history of this region, of the Buganda people, the Buganda Kiganda Kingdom, has one of the most well-developed historiographies, as far as I'm aware, in all of Africa. So many, largely men, but also some women, have studied this history. And they've based a lot of that work on these two foundational texts, Kagwa's Customs of Buganda and Roscoe's The Buganda Account of Their Native Customs and Beliefs. So they still anchor even contemporary scholarship. Although both mention the other titles that the King Mother, King Sister, and Kabaka Mukasa held, neither seriously entertains the existence of a world where a King Mother, King Sister, or King of the Sea actually existed as real kings. The more their works are cited, the more accurate this appears to become. There's also some issues that I mentioned in the book, can't go super deep into here, but issues with language. That English, in this translation, English doesn't have easily translatable or even a concept of a non-gendered person. So every sort of gender neutral term, mukasa is a gender neutral term. We could translate it as one who gives, is by default translated as a he. So in these translations of Luganda concepts and texts, so many of these gender neutral positions, including things like grandparent, child, if it is associated with a thread of power, those are almost exclusively translated as male figures, even though the original text or the stories doesn't describe them as being male. And so they could also be otherwise. So their texts don't exist, their texts don't recognize that there could be a king mother, a king sister, or a king of the sea, and that they would be real kings. So early on, Roscoe realized, he's trying to figure out what's happening in his world. He's recognizing things are transforming. He's also realizing that even his most trusted informants would, in Roscoe's words, allow some important thing to pass over and thus give the wrong impressions. So he was right. The source of these wrong impressions ran deeper than an individual kind of oversight, I think. So May Mandelbaum Edel translated a version of Kagwa's text, and in the note to in a preface to the most widely circulated English translation of his text, she speculates that because Kagwa was an active Protestant on good terms with the church, it would have, quote, been an extremely jeopardous undertaking for him to reveal, quote, too thorough an acquaintance of the sort he undoubtedly possessed with unorthodox faiths. And this idea that Kagwa knew what was going on but decided to conceal it is contested and really somewhat solidified in the dominant, largely patriarchal historiography of this area. So early on, Roscoe was told that the Buganda, quote, had no such customs on the matter of the spirits. So here's an outsider coming in, try to figure out what's going on. He has this sort of list of questions from a Scottish anthropologist going around asking people, or at least people coming to him to ask. And people said, no, we don't have any customs regarding spirits, ancestors, any of this. And further, though Roscoe noted it was strange, he reported that, quote, women were ignored in all the old customs. They did not take part in any of the ceremonies. So these are the first sort of very credible ethnographic accounts of gendered relations in Buganda. And these circulated widely among European staff of the newly formed protectorate government. And they also helped do the conceptual work of severing women from the field of religion. Women were ignored in all of the old customs. They didn't take part in any of the ceremonies, just as women were simultaneously being officially severed from the field of formal politics. So it wasn't simply his faith, Kagwa's Christian faith, that shaped what he was willing to document. Recognizing the depth and reach of what was glossed as religion would have located a lot of authority, territorial autonomy and moral authority within assemblage of islands and island women, both living and once living, including the king of the sea. Kagwa had already witnessed the powers of these women to challenge the king's son's authority by controlling sea travel, mobilizing support for early anti-colonial struggles, and issuing prophecies that actually proved to be correct. So by failing to document the existence of multiple female kings, Kagwa and Roscoe upheld fictitious colonial interpretations of kingship as a hierarchical system led by a singular male figure. When Kabaka is glossed in English as a singular male king, the multiplicity of who and how Kabaka actually were existing is not just obscured, it's erased from history. And I'm certain this happened in other contexts. It can't just be this one. And so this misinterpretation of female kingship in Buganda's past profoundly shaped how the lives of non-royal women were and still are understood. And nowhere to me is this clearer than in what happened to the story of Kintu and Nambi, which is the last sort of piece we'll look at here. So Kintu and Nambi is one of the literally most foundational stories in Buganda. It's taught to every Ugandan who attends primary school as a way of showing how the violence of singularity operates not just in the domain of formal politics and governance, but in the stories society tells itself about the way the world is. So we think of this as an origin story. It's described that way, a sort of moral framing of how people came to exist. As Donna Haraway reminds us, it matters what stories tell other stories, and it matters whose stories tell these stories. So again, Kintu and Nambi tale, Buganda's origin story, and describes how both life and death came to be realities for people on Earth. And in the next slide, we're going to see a sort of classic version of this tale told by Atiang Laura in her show called Know Your Roots, where she's going back into a variety of traditions. So we'll hear it in her words, the standard story.
Today we are looking at the traditional religion of the Baganda people. Now, most of us who have gone through Ugandan schools remember the story of Kintu and Nambi. Well, I hope you do. Now, just for a recap, Kintu was the first Muganda upon the surface of the earth, and he had his one cow. Then there was Gulu, who lived in heaven with his children, namely Nambi, Kayikuzi, and Walumbe. Occasionally, Nambi loved to come down to earth to play. And that is where she saw this handsome dude, Kintu, and she decided to talk to him and convince him to go with her to her father to seek for a marriage blessing, which Kintu did. Well, they got the blessing, but the father warned them not to return to heaven because Walumbe would follow them down, and that wasn't a nice thing according to the legend. On their way back to earth, Nambi remembered she had forgotten the millet for her chicken. So she decided to go back to heaven to pick, despite the fact that Kintu dissuaded her. She insisted and went back to pick the millet. And that is where she met Walumbe, who asked her where she was going, and at the end of it all, he forcefully followed her to earth. And that was the birth of disaster, according to the legend that has been taught to us.
Beautiful summary here. Those of us familiar with the story, this resonates clearly. But in other words, a curious, active, brave woman approaches a man, initiates a partnership, navigates a series of trials successfully, and then at the very last minute, disobeys her husband and her father, and literally brings death and destruction to the world. That's the standard story. For at least 100 years, Nambi and her disobedience have been said to, quote, be the cause of all evil, sickness, and death. And that quote comes from Kagwa's work himself. Except that the earliest written versions of the Kintu and Nambi story clearly state that it was Kintu, not Nambi, who went back for the millet and brought death to earth. In 1882, the same white fathers who landed at Chigungu in 1879 published the first written Luganda language version of the tale. According to their account, it was Kintu, not Nambi, who forgot the millet and decided to turn back against Nambi's protestations, not Kintu's. He was the one. If we interpret the whole thing as being responsible for suffering, it was Kintu, the male figure, not Nambi, the female one. Sir Harry Johnston's 1902 account, the Uganda Protectorate, was taken down, as he noted, directly from peasants, featured the same plot. It was Kintu who returned for the millet. It was Kintu who brought death. The reversal of this was solidified in John Roscoe and Apollo Kagwa's comprehensive and widely consulted accounts. In both versions, it's now Nambi who disobeys her father and her husband and brings Mr. Death, or Walumbe, to earth. And it is used by Kagwa himself, again, to justify the subservient position of women in Buganda, quote, a great deal of which he wrote had to do with the suffering of women. Another example of just how extremely fascinating this is to me and powerful. So a writer named Alice Werner published an alternative version of the story. So by Kagwas, I think published in 1912, version, those and the English language version of Kagwa's widely consulted book published in the early 1930s, those become the authoritative versions. So a writer named Alice Werner published an alternative version in 1925, one which it was Kintu who insisted on returning for the grain against Nambi's protestations. So Werner, I'm not sure if she collected her stories herself, but at least she was consulting those early versions for that story. In the digitized version of that book that's now available on Hathi Trust, someone has drawn a vertical line next to this passage and written in the margin, "The other way around!" underline. As far as I can tell, it's the only passage in the entire book that inspired a reader to deface it. And that's a passage that says that it's a male figure who's responsible for making a mistake and bringing death to the world. So much of an outrage as to deface a library book. And for scholars, that's serious business. So this reversal wasn't innocent. As the anthropologist Benjamin Ray argued in the 1980s, Buganda Catholic and Protestant writers from the mid-20th century intentionally linked Nambi's supposed transgressions to those of Eve in the biblical story of Adam and Eve. So Kintu and Nambi become Adam and Eve. Nambi becomes responsible for the transgressions. Both supposedly disobeyed a divine commandment and are blamed for bringing suffering to the world. So the intellectual labor of these Kiganda historians was not intended to explain the past. It was intended to explain the newly subservient position of women within the governance arrangements that Christianity and colonialism sought to instantiate. So some photos, admittedly, these are elite women, but positioned perhaps in a subservient position itself. So in 1897, the crowning of a one-year boy as the singular male Kabaka, the 1900 Buganda Agreement formalizing land tenure, the removal of women entirely from the palace in 1906, the burning of Mukasa's house, the revision of Kintu and Nambi's stories. These were not separate events. They were a coordinated transformation, the making of a world in which singularity, maleness, and Christian morality became the only legitimate organizing principles of governance, of history, of life itself. So in late 2024, we're returning to that church in Chigungu. Littoral residents purportedly set fire to that large Catholic church, the very same one established in honor of the arrival of the White Fathers. Just burning some of the objects, not actually burning the church down. Although the church itself still stands, this act draws attention to the continued existence of a world that is resistant to that singular version of moral and material reality that Christianity, colonial governance, and now the contemporary Ugandan state seeks to make the only real one. The statues still stand here of the White Fathers, and sometimes during fierce storms or when water levels are particularly high, again, they become submerged by the sea. So singular versions of the arrival of the White Fathers, of a singular male king, of women as the source of all suffering, these continue to compose the curriculum of Uganda's contemporary citizenry and scholars of Uganda and Ugandans alike. Together, they naturalize a version of a singular past by submerging actually existing historical multiplicity. And still, the multiple persists. We can see it in the stories of residents of Chigungu still tell, in the brass rings that the Sese Island chiefs were still wearing in the 1930s, in the margin of a library book where someone drew a line and wrote the other way around, and in the work that fish workers continue to do this to this day. So that is all I have for you today, though. We are up. Yes. I'm taking a small bow. That is what I have for you today. I look forward to our conversation, and perhaps the next time I present this, I will have a very clear and definitive ending to the presentation. But thank you for being with us here today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for not only very interesting, but very engaging. You are a great storyteller. The way you
Thank you.
read it was just great. Took me back to listening stories about Mummy Waters and all of that.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm from Senegal, so we also have goddesses of the water, and yeah, so I don't think we went as far as Uganda, at least in the curriculum. We still think them as women, not men.
That's
So,
right.
but very, very, very interesting, very, very interesting story. So, please raise your hand if you have questions, and or you can type them in the Q&A section, the chat. So,
Mhm.
yeah, wow, very fascinating. Yeah. So feel free also to raise your hand if you have questions. I can unmute you. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to say shocked because I think even if it's not in this domain, but just wondering how post-colonial, what most of our history is. So why this continuation of the womanization, I would call it, of the Africans, at least this African story. So
Mm.
why is it that there is no pushback on, as you say, on historians or people in charge of education? Why is this continued transmission of this story is going on? I think is very problematic for me.
Agreed, and is precisely why I've attempted to create a well-cited counter narrative to this, because I think it's sort of easy to dismiss the what I talk about is the multiplicity, or at least these other versions of history, as something silly or not real, because the serious historians have already documented what happened, and they're trained in Cambridge and wherever else, and also that's beginning to change, I believe. There's a number of scholars, including Holly Hansen, and others, who are looking at different forms of power and the way it operated in the past, which is also has encouraged other scholars of the deep past to think about things differently here. But it's still the female Kabaka are not considered on the same plane. It's like, okay, sometimes it's a footnote, sometimes it's they existed and their power did some things, but there are other ways of thinking this past, and for my work on the fisheries, it became so important to look at this because there's a simultaneous narrative that women never fished. Women were never involved in fisheries. And so anything they're doing now is a very contemporary thing. So also minimizing women's long held work and labor and contributions to nourishing eaters of fish in this area. And a lot of the book talks about that kind of stuff. So this was a sort of parallel historical development. And there's also in the book I show an image, and I can show you if you want, but it's not that important, of like the stories that women never fished. But here's a very detailed drawing by a travel writer at this time that says Buganda women trading fish and pottery, and so there's an incredible opportunity, I think, also to read the sources differently against the grain, as Jim Scott might say. And also a fantastic, I was like really fortunate that a number of these texts that aren't always the ones that are widely cited became freely available and scanned online and frankly searchable for terms I was interested in. So it started with fish, but then it became every single pronunciation of Mukasa, and all different kinds of vernacular names of fish, and the sea, and different kinds of Lubale figures. And so um, really spending time with those sources and trying to find as much information as possible that hasn't kind of appeared in the formal historical narratives became really important method for getting into this. And such an exciting time actually to be able to look at these things. And yes. So I see we have a hand up. I'd be very happy to hear. And then I'm not overlooking that we have a fascinating question from Jonathan Earl, one of these fantastic scholars of this area too.
Okay, so Solomon, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer Lee Johnson.
You're welcome.
You have made me to know something which I have never learned about. I'm a lecturer in history in Uganda here in one of the universities. But you have unearthed stories and histories that we have never had in our curriculum. I am saying thank you so much. And you are actually more than a Ugandan in the way you have presented. If you were near me, I would name you Namukasa as a gift. And therefore, we as Africans and as Ugandans, we should learn to make in-depth research, to rewrite our histories, because we are only learning what is stereotype. So once again, I thank you so much. You have motivated me. Maybe one time when I come to Europe, I will investigate about the history of Napoleon Bonaparte from African perspective. Thank you so much.
I love that. Maybe come to the United States and tell us something extremely important about our founding fathers also that we have, our myth of founding fathers that we forgot.
I hope I will soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I would love to have conversations in the future if that's something you're interested in. We can share my email. If you just look up Jennifer Lee Johnson, my MSU site has my email as well. I'd love to. That means so much to me. There were a lot of sleepless nights where Mukasa and other figures I came to know. Syria Maluma is one of them who features in the book. Didn't let me stop thinking about these things. They're like, there's something important going on here that needs to be investigated. And I'm so fortunate to have the privilege to be able to do that and to have that be my job. I'm grateful for it almost every single day. But when I think about it, I'm always grateful. So I remind myself to be grateful about it. But it's tremendous.
That is great. I would love to have your email because I'm very much interested in historical research.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
If I may share Dr. Jonathan Earl's question. Question about the following. So there were multiple Uganda glosses and expressions for Kabaka, Baka Baka, Base Kabaka in the deep past. Prior to the late 1800s, other terms would have been far more common, most notably Sabataka. So Bataka, like sort of chiefs, political power consolidated in an area. One who had brought clans together into a coherent, if ever-changing polity. Am I arguing that Buganda had more than one Sabataka, and that Daudi Chwa was the first monarch to be appointed as the sole Sabataka? If so, how do you reconcile this with the word's grammatical use in clan histories throughout Buganda, which talks about Sabataka in the singular? To my knowledge, no other Balubale or Kabaka was ascribed the title Sabataka. This is a very provocative question, actually. And the clear answer is to say, I don't know. And I also am vaguely aware that this is actually a very political question. So I did spend some time interviewing a man whose very short name is Mwanga Charles, who calls himself the minister. I'm not sure if he's still in the same position. In fact, they may have been kicked off their land. But the Minister of Culture for Entebbe Zamugula, which is at a very important cultural site specifically for the islands that the British colonial administration put an airfield on top of. So the Entebbe International Airport is literally built on the grave sites of important ancestors and powerful people. So this figure called himself the Bataka of that area, and situated his position in opposition to the dominant kingship version that is generally accepted. So I did not. I've always been fascinated by this. I've been fascinated about Entebbe Zamagula, particularly also how, because my interest in the islands, this is a site visually from we're looking I'm looking at it, you're not looking at it. If we were looking at the statues of the first the arrival of the White Fathers at Chigungu, we could look to our left and we would see, I think, five um, uh, rock formations, large rock formations that get smaller and smaller as they go out into the sea. And on those, people map different levels from homestead, subclans, clans, up to the kingdom. And there's talk about important historical meetings that happen in these places. So that's all to say, that's a lot to say. I don't know, but it seems that I've heard inklings of other kinds of threads about this. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it too, John. Yeah. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer either, but I really appreciate the question, and it urges me to think think about this in ways I haven't in a long time.
Bahati, thank you, Jennifer. Bahati, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for the good presentation. I like it. I love your presentation. It was very interesting for us to listen the history, and I love the history. So my question on the is on the part of the title where you name that before God, women were king. And when I was just listening to the presentation, it's just like the coming of the missionary and the way they just like trying to introduce God to the people of those of Uganda, and I can see like they just like bring like something like maybe like discriminating maybe the women and just like eliminating the women in the leadership. So my question is, the way title is just like state like before God. It means like introducing God has led to the like impacting the women or just like eliminating the women into power. And like I think like it can like bring like maybe like I don't know like a negative perception to the people like, oh, just like we know God, God is good, God is faithful. And later when we read this book, like God has brought all these problems to the woman. So I was just like kind of like those questions. So I would like maybe can you explain to me so that I can be I'd love to hear you to explain me about the title. Yeah. Thank
Yes,
you.
I appreciate that. The shortest answer is to say that I am aware that it is one of the busiest times in anyone's semester. And how can I have a provocative title that encourages people to come to this talk? So that also sums up like some of the arguments I was making. So I have never framed it exactly as bluntly as sort of before God was a man, women were kings. But who the figure or what God was transformed in this. And I don't have any strong personal religious convictions. And I also am wary of sort of villainizing a version of the world that bring people a lot of peace and hope.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate you bringing up that tension, but
Yeah.
I do think who God was, and I've struggled with maybe there's a clear parallel. I mean, if we go for like Father, Son, Holy Ghost, when I
Mm-hmm.
think of that, those are all male figures.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
what's in my brain. So
Yeah.
when from Father, Son, Holy Ghost, something may be that, I mean, it was these figures of King Mothers, King Daughters, King Sons, Kabaka Mukasa. Kabaka Mukasa becomes or is sort of described as the highest national god.
Oh, okay.
Um, and missionaries were trying like, okay, is there a clear word? Is there a clear, is the concept of God easily translatable? And how do we sort of spread it here? And okay, this figure Katonda is
Mm-hmm.
one. Others would say Katonda is not, it wasn't even real before. So it's a tension. I don't want people to
Yeah,
read this, to read my book and say, oh my gosh, I have to throw out my
yeah.
entire philosophy of the world.
Okay.
The point is to open up possibility for something otherwise.
Okay,
That
okay.
other world becomes plausible. We don't have to
Mhm.
believe that it fully existed or whatever else, but
Okay,
it's possible to be different
okay,
is my wish
okay.
for that.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
thank you so much
yeah.
for
Thank you. I
sharing.
love it. Thank you.
My pleasure. Whew. Yeah, so some grappling with contradictions of religion and Christianity. Um, Janet Munakamwe asks, is it because women presented themselves as super powerful, or was this a tradition smuggled in by missionaries from their social structures in Europe? These contradictions between religion and Christianity and patriarchy. Yeah, I mean, I think it's this, it's the word I'm thinking of is funky. I don't know. Like, there are these stories, okay, speak. Let's go try to speak and grant. Let's find the source of the Nile. And for a long time, the body of water that became Lake Victoria wasn't even on the world map. But it was on Al-Idrisi's like 1100 map of the world. So there's a part of the world that knows this body of water exists. The Euro-American world doesn't know fully until they fully find it. Anyway, they're going, Speak has this meeting ostensibly with the male king. And he says, please come to Buganda, bring your Christian God. And one reason that's given for his request is that he says, well, you're run by a female king. Gets translated as queen, but let's say you're run by a king mother. You're run by a king mother, so we must have a lot in common. Like, come on in. I mean, those are fraught moments, but that's an example of a continuity that's used to hold things up. But then it's like, this is the Queen of England. She visits Uganda. She presides over a large and violent empire in ways that I don't think historians have done enough to document the violence, not the presiding by the queen. Um, but that's to say she operates as a figurehead in that universe, and it's others that are actually doing the sort of political operating going on. So I don't have all of these answers, but it reminds me of these interesting moments of continuity and also tension between these sort of different worlds, one of the sea and one of a world that sought to make a body of water named after an English queen that could be controlled, where there were steamships and all kinds of things happening. Yeah, Janet also asks, in terms of the spatial and geographical analysis, according to the folklores, where exactly were heaven and earth located? Yeah, heaven was described as Gulu, just sort of up, but also northern Uganda, also largest city and areas known as Gulu. So um, I think there are different versions of this. I don't have a single idea of where it's solidified. Some say there are cracks. I mean, I've been shown cracks in rocks, and people say um, that is where death, or that is where other things are located, and other places where there are um, yeah, whew, I'm flashing back to being in Entebbe Zamukula and being shown basically a coffin with black and white cloth over top that is to me representing what was described to me as also representing this duality of life and death itself, that they're always kind of coexisting. Um, Janet, these are questions that I didn't ask. So I don't have definitive answers. And you may actually know much more than I do about this. But it is an interesting question, especially thinking about how much like the physicality and reality of the shoreline and islands and water and fish play in this. Like thinking about where are these things located, I think is a really interesting question. And there's a question also talking about how this chapter fits in the book. I appreciate that. Um, the yeah, so there's an introduction where I'm leading with these contemporary moments of actual state violence. I mean, the president of Uganda has said that he is fighting a guerrilla war against fish workers. So a man who came into power through a guerrilla war that then becomes the myth of the contemporary Uganda, not the myth, but a founding story of the contemporary Ugandan nation is now, in his words, fighting a guerrilla war against fish workers, against illegal fishing, in order to enforce a singular version of sustainability. So the second chapter begins with Bakachi Robert and much more complex and in-depth description of the challenges that he himself is grappling between as someone moving between this sort of global idea of sustainability and the norms and realities of the shoreline where he lives, to then look at this multiplicity of actually existing fisheries. So the sort of industrial side and what I call the vernacular side of things. So each chapter is trying to open up a multiplicity and otherwise that exists. Then we move back historically, and we have this piece. The next chapter is about the sleeping sickness, described as an epidemic, but I talk about it as a pandemic because it was world making. It made it possible. The death of hundreds of thousands of residents of these shores made it possible for really Uganda as it is now to exist, but in the context of the book, arguing it made it possible for Lake Victoria and fisheries of Lake Victoria to exist as a thing that could be controlled. I started looking at this because the first fisheries regulations were actually in the sleeping sickness regulations. So outbreak of sleeping sickness tried to be controlled. Really, these tensions emerge, and tsetse flies helped establish colonial control of the shorelines. I don't think they did it. Tsetse flies did it on purpose, but tsetse flies carrying parasites did. Then comes a chapter about multiple forms of what I'm understanding as multiple forms of fish that we might consider to be the same. Residents know them as nkeje, and they're really important for Kabaka Mukasa. It's a big part of the story that was left out here, and because like both daily nourishment and exceptional sort of moments in one's life, birth, death, and becoming a named existing person within a family. And KJ are super important for that. So I talk about a version of that as in KJ. Another version is haplochromine cichlids that evolutionary biologists and ecologists are fascinated with. They think that these fish are evolution's smoking gun, as they call it. And also a version of these fish that fishery managers just call trash. They're like literally called trash fish. So I look at how these three different versions are come to be and also coexist still. And then there's some other stuff. What is it? I don't know. How food doesn't exist without sauce, and the figure of Syria Maluma, and growing commercial fisheries for fish that are assumed to be extinct. So each one tries to open up a multiplicity and all as a way to demonstrate that there are already existing alternatives to this dominant form of sustainability that does so much violence to fish workers and eaters of fish in this area, which is so almost everyone would like to enjoy some delicious fish and a sumptuous meal here. So yeah, I mean, people's livelihoods are destroyed for the singular version of sustainability in the name of food security. And these are people that are actually feeding people. So ideas about what nature is, what a good fishery looks like, what a sustainable fishery is come in here. There's a big part of the story that's also about the introduction of an invasive species, which becomes the singular feature of what sustainability is. So the British introduced an invasive species right before Uganda gains so-called independence, and then introduction of the invasive species becomes official policy of the Colonial Fisheries and Game Department. And that department was still run by guys from the UK until the 70s. So they were introducing this invasive species. That invasive species becomes the source of a major industrial fishery that is largely exported to Europe in the form of frozen fish fillets. So that particular thing is actually what brought me to looking at this.
We're
Oh,
almost
in the
out of
question.
time, and I just want to make sure that we recognize Mikia's question. It's on the Q&A section. You might not have seen it. You have to click on more, and then you're gonna,
Oh,
yeah, so there is
is it
one
the one
question.
about Stella Nyanzi? Is that the question? Or no?
Yeah, it say, how can you relate, or is it possible to relate to Mat, the goddess of ethics of the ancient civilization of Kemet?
Oh my goodness.
It's in the Q&A.
Oh, the cute. Oh, okay. I'm looking at the chat. Oh, forgive me.
Oh, no problem.
Never done a webinar before. Okay, now I have. Can you relate, or is it possible that Mot, the goddess of ethics in the ancient? I don't know about this goddess, but I absolutely will tell you that these are Mukasa other figures called Misambwa, which are situated sort of nature spirits in English, but that's not really an adequate term. They are ethical beings themselves. And that sense of ethics, morality, is built in linguistically into the words themselves. So this is an exciting avenue of something to look at. And if you'd like to talk about it together, I would love to do that. I would love to learn from you. And I will also check it out a little bit myself. I really appreciate that question. Always love hearing about goddess of ethics elsewhere that exist.
So
And then
maybe just one more question if about from Janet, if you
yes, so I have
engage with.
read Stella Nyanzi's work, and I've had the pleasure to meet her in Uganda a couple times. Um, uh, Her work did not feature in this directly, although I mean, that's an oversight. I think there's a good place to be in conversation with that work more. But yes, there are other Ugandan feminist scholars who absolutely, Janet Musisi, for example, like they help us understand. They open up space for examination of the otherwise, also by helping us think through how gender worked in this sort of formal palace. Really important work. Also by Sylvia Nanonge Tamas. I'm forgetting the details right now. Arguing that gender operated differently within the palace spaces, that those closest to royal power are read male, and that's something that I see working also in fisheries contexts where women who own fishing boats and employ fishermen, they are called sebo or sir, and not nyabo or madam. I mean, sometimes they're called madam, of course, but also they're also recognized as power, but as associated with maleness that we would associate with sebo or sir. So I appreciate that question and that provocation, because I'm thinking it might be useful to write an article version of this chapter. So it might, I don't know, may have a wider resonance than somebody who would be interested in reading a book about sustainability, perhaps. Because I think there are other places where very similar things have happened over time. And it's not like they happened thousands of years ago. It's like 100, 125 years ago. We have pictures. We have written records of the otherwise that already exist. And those were not available to feminist anthropologists, for example, who were trying in the 90s to understand if patriarchy was a timeless thing. Like the sources they were looking at were Kagwa and Roscoe's. And so the determination when pioneering feminist scholars were looking to examine these questions, their sources themselves, they couldn't read the sources differently because they didn't have enough of them, I think. So then that also inadvertently sort of works to reproduce that image of the timelessness or the like universal dominance of men, I think is what how it's referred to in an article I'm thinking about by Sherry Ortner and Anna Singh and others. Yay. Thank you for connecting. I'm really happy to be invited to this today. It's so wonderful to connect around this work and have the challenge about presenting it. It was a really great experience for me. And I'm grateful and I look forward to the conversations that I hope will continue.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Johnson, and congratulations for the book. We look forward to it. Yes,
Thank you. I've been
yes.
working on it for it feels like an embarrassing amount of time. So I am absorbing those congratulations and share. Thank you. It means a lot.
Multiple congratulations.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody for attending. This is our last Ion Africa of the semester. So wishing everybody who's finishing the semester a wonderful end of semester. And wishing everybody also a great summer, restful, productive summer to everyone. And we'll see you next fall, inshallah.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.